So, thank you for joining me in this conversation. So the whole direction of my talk conversation at this moment is improving the management policy issues in society. That's what I want to do. And for that purpose, I am going to, I want to put you on the borders. Right, let me just start. Sorry to keep you waiting there.
It's okay.
The way I will start is with the notion of nation states and institutions, and what I will develop later on as an enterprise model. The concept of nation states is used as a characteristic of contemporary states, without prejudice to the fact that today most of them are multi-ethnic, many are multinational, and many combine both conditions. So when they started the conversation about this idea of nation state, I was working with two additional leads, Germán Bula, who is a specialist in institutions, and Klaas Ottovene, who is a specialist in second-order cybernetics. And the idea that we had at that time was to connect to the Westphalian states. As you know, in 1646, I think, there was a treaty that led to the Westphalian treaty with different nation states, and the idea was to create them as independent. This was something that followed from many other developments, going from the French Revolution and the industrial developments and so on. But that is the concept that I will use a little bit more later on. That is the Westphalian state. And what I will do is I want to offer an invitation to globalize local problems and to distribute global concerns with the support of an enterprise complexity model. So I will connect to the nation state the idea of local problems and and to institutions the idea of global concerns with the support of a cybernetic model, which is the enterprise complexity. Interactions between nation states sharing local problems and institutions with global concerns need attention to overcome fragmentation and avoid isolated efforts. I will propose the enterprise complexity models as an extension of the viable system model to improve relationships in organizational systems. This enterprise complexity model is about the management of complexity in organizational systems and through the application of recursive structures, the central concept of this conversation. So the central concept to develop here is the concept of cooperative structures. And I want to make the distinction: autonomy and independence. As for relations between nation states, we distinguish from a cybernetic perspective autonomous and independent countries. By the way, please at any stage so that I clarify things that I have not been clear enough. But certainly I will be happy to clarify issues as they come. One of these, I think, is the distinction I'm making between autonomous countries and independent countries. An autonomous nation state have operational closure within the context of a larger organization system. So when we have the states of the United States of America, these are each of the states has operational closure, and it is part of the larger country, which is the United States. And independent nation states are those that have operational closure in their own right, without necessarily belonging to a larger organizational system. So that is something that I connect very closely to South America. South America is full of independent states which do not belong to a state like was the dream of Simón Bolívar in his days.
Raul, I have a question of clarification.
Yes, please.
First of all, when you say institutions with global concerns, could you give one or two examples? And secondly, could you, it sounds like when you say organizational system, you're meaning some kind of conglomerate of nation states and institutions with global concerns, or are you? So what examples of institutions with global concerns and a clarification about what is an organizational system?
For instance, example of institution with global concern would be the energy agency or the World Organization for systems in all kinds of that you will see socially. A global institution is also the United Nations, is all the institutions that in a way are providing a kind of framework for the development of organizational the organizational states, the state nation states.
Sorry. I was going to say, apropos that, is there a role for multinational companies in your model?
Eventually, yes. At this stage, making strictly the distinction between nation states and institutions in the sense I have just described.
Thank you.
But certainly multinational corporations and all of that may well come into this later on. And what I think is an autonomous, independent country, in a way, I'm trying to make the distinction between those that belong within the larger organizations and those that have their own independent closure.
Thank you.
A collaborative world with requisite variety. Policymakers, researchers and stakeholders need to reflect upon better futures with the current difficulties of nation states, collaborating with institutions. This is necessary to argue for a more collaborative world. Policymakers, researchers, and when they are reflecting upon better futures, they need to develop collaboration in the context of global institutions. It is necessary to argue for a more collaborative world. Now, is that aspect that I'm proposing to look at in the context of the law of requisite variety as a key conceptual tool to discuss the issue of autonomy and independence. So this concept, this idea of requisite variety is absolutely well recognized, but I will just say a few words about that to support my developments later on. I can show you here is that if we have a situation, which I am calling here a black box, where we have controllable resources and we have outputs coming from the black box, and also we have desirable states, we compare the outputs with the desirable states, and requisite variety is available when the outcomes are included within the desirable states. And for that, what we need is to have the capacity to act upon the situation of the controllable resource, which is here the idea of dealing with the environmental disturbances and matching the complexity of the external environment with the complexity of the black box. So I will use this idea especially with the idea of correcting variety imbalances between actors in the black box and agents in the environment through self-organization. So what I expect is that within the black box, there will be an effort to relate the different resources in processes of self-organization, and that there will be somehow matching the varieties, affecting them coming from their external environments. So if they have capacity to correct these variety imbalances, then we will say that they may achieve requisite variety. The VSM and enterprise complexity model. The enterprise complexity model is a methodological extension of the VSM focused on policy making and problem solving rather than on the viability of an enterprise. So this is perhaps the key distinction that I make between the viable model, which is focused on enterprises and the viability of an enterprise, and the enterprise complexity model, which I am presenting it as a methodological extension of the VSM with the purpose of policy making and problem solving. I use, I'll explain later in this presentation, the Y-plan methodology for this extension. So the Y-plan methodology, I offer it as a way to produce this extension. The enterprise complexity model uses the VSM as a modeling tool to overcome the fragmentation of situations and that require flexibility, creativity, and adaptability. That require systemicity. So one of the characteristics of policy issues, as we all know, is that there are multiple institutions and organizations, and that they are often fragmented. They are not very much connected. And what we, and I will argue in what follows, is that it is very important to develop the systemicity of these resources so that they come together into something that is dealing with a policy issue of concern. So this is the basic idea of the VSM, as you well know. Perhaps the point I want to emphasize is that viable systems have capacity to create policies, to regulate these policies, and to implement policies. And I'm offering this model that you have in front of you, for society. So rather than having resources split all over the place, I am now offering a framework here, which is the viable system model, which connects all these resources along the directions of policy, intelligence, cohesion, coordination, and implementation. So that's the basic idea that I will later on. Now, here I start to get into something that is realized. I make the distinction between hierarchical strategies and recursive strategies. So the hierarchical strategies to manage complexity, they tend to transform the resources that they contain, the systems contain, into or units which don't have lack operational closure. They are independent and they are more interested in themselves than in the totality of the situation that we are dealing with. On the other hand, the recursive strategy is one which contains autonomous units within autonomous units, and these units have operational closure. So that means that they themselves can generate through their interactions the relations that will produce their own policies and their ability to implement activities. So viable systems, recursive structures, and distributed requisite variety. Viable system, recursive structure. That's the way that Stafford Beer proposed that, with autonomous viable components in their implementation. It is expected that each of them is constituted policy, regulation, and implementation, and that self-organization embodies the resources necessary to constitute them. So that's what I'm proposing as the idea of a recursive structure that is of autonomous viable within autonomous viable components. The challenge is managing situational complexity through recursive structures, that is, through the collaboration of components, matching situational environmental complexity at several autonomous levels, mostly through self-organization at acceptable levels of performance, and these are levels that correct imbalances. So the basic challenge that in managing is that I'm proposing for policy making and for policies in particular is that managing the situational, I am offering an approach to manage the complexity of these situations, and I'm saying that structures are the form to produce these recursive structures that increase the capacity to manage situational complexity. So if a policy is highly complex, I would expect that the organizational management of that policy will have several recursives in its own structure, and that's that I'm proposing here as a recursive structure. Each of these levels within the organization is aiming at correcting variety imbalances. So I would say clearly at the multiple levels in which this is happening, at which the organization system is dealing with the environmental policy, at each of these levels, we will have autonomous units, and each will have means to correct the variety imbalances that they hit in their environment. And that is the theoretical unfolding of complexity. This is the way in which I think most people use the ideas of requisite of unfolding of complexity, and that's exactly what I'm showing here. I'm going to move slightly away from there. Decentralization through a clean recursive structure may be terrible but difficult. So the diagram I have just shown is a paradigm, is a way to approach the decentralization of the complexity processes in an organizational system. And that is highly desirable to have these clean recursive structures, but in practice, they are very, very difficult. In practice, we find that they are not clearly producing the unfolding that is in the diagram that I showed just now. Decentralization is a strategy to implement policies. This is a strategy to create a social complexity through reducing undesirable and assuming that self-organization will, in one form or another, do the job. So that within each of the autonomous units, I will expect that they develop the self-organization and they operate with limited undesirable controls over them, and it is the self-organization that will produce the responses and generate the capacity for policy making. While the recursive structure with autonomous units contained within autonomous units at all operational, all with operational closure, aligned with the purposes of the containing system is highly desirable, it may be operationally difficult to achieve. So I'm repeating something here that is, I'm basically saying, well, a recursive structure with autonomous units contained within autonomous units, all with operational closure, with the purpose of the system is highly desirable. It may be operationally difficult to achieve. What you find more in the practice that we have of policy issues in policy implementation, what I hear and a chaotic management of complexity for a policy issue. This is, I think, a central part of the argument I'm developing here. So what I have here is that rather than the neat unfolding that I was showing in the diagram before, what you have is that certain circles here match certain aspects of the policy issue, and within them you may have unfoldings of one kind or another, but also you may have independent resources that are not really dealing with the policy issue directly. They are only indirectly. And then you have that within the larger circle, you have systems that are contained within them that are dealing with aspects of the policy issue, but not very much totally contained within the situation of concern, and they are dealing independently with their own policy, their own complexity management. And that is what I think, as a matter of practice, you are likely to find in situations all over the place. That is that the general organizational system that we are trying to use for the implementation of a policy, in fact, is distributed among multiple subsystems, each of them dealing with aspects of the policy, but not necessarily well contained within. And that is one of the aspects that I refer to as moving in the direction of giving systemicity to the policy issues. So if the situation in general is that the organizational resources dealing with the policy issues are somehow distributed, and some of them dealing with aspects of the situation, leaving to others to deal with other, therefore having some degree of fragmentation in all the generation and management of the policies. What clearly we are trying to establish here is how do we move in the direction of systemicity? So how is it that something highly disconnected moves in the direction of something that is far more connected? And that is moving from a chaotic management of complexity for a policy issue into a more systemic management of the policy issue. I'm just offering the opportunity to ask for, see if anybody thinks that this is not clear. Can I ask comments or ideas around this? So I assume that this is fairly clear.
Bernard here, Raul.
Yes.
We have an example or two of a real world situation which corresponds to what you're talking about, either in the proper systemicity form or this chaotic form.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I think what you find if we are talking about climate change or talking about a policy that is trying to the problems of inadequate handling of the complexity, shall we say, the Brazilian management of the forestry in the Amazon. What you have is you have a general policy, which I would call here the policy of climate change, and then within the policy of climate change, we may have several responses that are not very much aligned with that, like here, for instance, the deforestation of the Amazon, and the result of that is that that creates difficulties in achieving a good response to what in social terms we need for this particular policy issue. And so increasing the systemicity in a way, fortunately we have someone like Lula coming as a president of Brazil. And I think what Lula is going to try, as he has explained in his initial proposals, is to move that this circle, which is partially connected to the larger circle, to move it more in the direction of the general policy of climate change and responding to the demands of the climate change. Is that clear, Bernard?
Yes, I think so. It's very helpful as an example of when things aren't working well. As you were speaking, what came to my mind was the relationship between the National Health Service and the care service, which ought to be one large integrated service working together policy-wise, but it's still not. It's still fragmented in various ways. So I understand the concept now. Thank you.
Yeah, and certainly what we are trying to do and you hear all the time these days, is that you need to bring social services together with health services, and that is in a way politicians trying to tell us that they want to increase the systemicity of the health social services together.
Yes, thank you.
Right. So I have explained the chaotic distribution of complexity makes integrated policy implementation difficult, and we have just given examples of that. In the above figures, some of the circles are partially embedded in the global system and contribute to the creation, regulation, and production of other non-fully integrated policy issues. That's the case of social services, as explained by Bernhard. The driving conceptual framework for this purpose is of the VSM, which offers a heuristic for systemicity. I have repeated this a number of times. So a strategy of systemicity is increasing the quality of complexity unfolding. As a policy situation moves towards an effective of complexity, the chances are that response to challenges will achieve better performance. So that's where what I was suggesting, that requisite variety should be somehow matched at each level, is something that relates to increasing the quality of the unfolding of complexity. A fundamental structural proposition from the perspective of managing problem solving is to increase the quality of complexity to match more environmental complexity with less resources. I think that is quite straightforward. The VSM gives a heuristic to improve the organizational structures, backing the management of policy issues. Now, it is at this stage that I can bring into this context the Westphalian dilemma from where I started. It is in this context Westphalia is brought back as an example of a structural dilemma. It gives an insight to deal with conflicts between local and global management of resources. So it is here that I make a connection with something that I discussed some time back, in fact, in 1989, which I call the control dilemma. So one of the issues that is typical to organizations, to business organizations, is that the autonomous units or the plants or whatever that are producing the policies of the company tend to go in their own direction, and what the global level does is it puts more restrictions into them, and these restrictions, saying you are doing things your own way but not according to the policies of the organization, is creating a conflict between the autonomous unit and the global organization. And that is what, at that stage, control dilemma. At this stage now, I think I will make a connection with what is happening with policy making between the global level and the local level. The dilemma is that wealthy independent states may be more concerned with their own interests, increase their own response capacity, rather than contributing to global policies such as climate change. So support for the collaboration of weaker nation states may be countered by strong independent states more interested in their own local policy implementation. These independent responses are achieved at the expense of an integrated higher performance implementation of the global policy. This is an example of a control dilemma. The more cohesion is necessary to achieve collaborative policies, the strong nation states may behave balancing locally their own varieties with local environments, reducing the overall efficacy of the global policy. So the Westphalian dilemma is basically trying to say strong nation states, like, for instance, and the United States, they sometimes are more interested in pursuing their own interests and not balance through collaboration with requirements and for the less powerful nation states. And they produce independent responses at the expense of an integrated higher performance implementation of the global policy. This, the more cohesion is necessary to achieve collaborative policies. Strong nation states may behave balancing locally their own varieties with local environments, reducing the overall efficacy of the global policy. For these global policies, improvement requires moving towards recursive structures with autonomous rather than independent fragmenting nation states. So, am I clear with the idea of the Westphalian dilemma? The Westphalian dilemma is one that is triggered by strong nation states rather than pursuing the policy needs that may be required by the United Nations or by the by any of the larger institutions. They pursue their own interests, their own requirements at the cost of generating the policies that are proposed by the multiple institutions that are dealing with climate change or dealing with aspects of energy management and so on. So we have, on the one hand, institutions that want to pursue particular policies, and on the other you have nation states that they see that they can pursue locally their own interests, and therefore they may be successful in doing that, but at the same time they are increasing the misuse of resources. So that is what I'm proposing as the Italian dilemma, where institutions are somehow, by the way the nations, the strong nation states pursue their own policies, cost of the global integration of the policy, which will require to include all the rest of the states, nation states, in order to increase the quality of the policies that globally the society wants and requires. For these global policies, improvement requires moving towards recursive structures with autonomous rather than independent, fragmenting nation states. That's what I have explained so far. So an example of this, cohesive autonomy and powerful global institutions. A sustainable future requires overcoming powerless global institutions with the collaborative power of autonomous, cohesive nation states. So very often we find that the global institutions, like the ones I have mentioned, they find themselves lacking in capacity to implement their policies, and on the other hand, the problem is nation states may have the power that they lack. That's something that I remember seeing last year when in Glasgow there was the attempt to reduce the level of CO2s through a collaborative effort of about 200 different nation states. That's where we can understand that the strategy for COP26 was correcting variety imbalances of independent nation states towards their autonomous cohesion to influence the policies of global institutions responsible for emissions in the larger environment. So that is one of the aspects that I believe today and this year with COP27 we are moving again into this direction, is that there is the need to we have hundreds of nation states trying to pursue their own requirements and interests, and they balance the varieties that they handle in their own environments, but they need the support of strengths, the cohesive efforts coming from the general global institutions. So that's one of the aspects, one of the examples I can see today is affecting this balance between local autonomy, local independence, and the lack of autonomy, which is the outcome of inadequate cohesive forces. From a design perspective, this is self-organization within a guiding context, that is autonomy that uses human, technical, and other resources for the simultaneous improvement of local nation states and global institutions. So I that many of the problems that we have today comes from the need to produce this balancing between the improvement in local nation states in their interactions and relations with global institutions. So, as I will explain in a minute, I am not trying to say is that these global institutions should develop themselves viable structures. I'm saying they have policy concerns, but in a way they have to accept that they have hundreds of different organizations, nation states operating within them. Here I come with the enterprise complexity model as an extension of the VSM. The enterprise complexity model offers methodological support to achieve effective recursion for policy issues. So that's as I have said, to move in the direction of systemicity, we need to have the possibility of effective recursion for policy issues. The enterprise complexity model is a reflexive interactive approach that improves communications in such a way that people can contribute more effectively to correcting variety imbalances at their own structural levels. It is a methodological aid for self-organization. So that's what the way I am introducing the enterprise complexity model. Nation states and global systems of governance. The required cohesive forces for the participation of nations in global situations does not assume that they should be components of a global system of governance. So that's one point I want to make. It would be terribly easy and naive to say what is to have all these nation states as parts of a viable organization, which may be the United Nations or any of the organization or any other of these institutions. I am basically not taking that view. The required cohesive forces for the participation of nations in global situations does not assume that they should be components of a global system of governance. So I am not moving in that direction. Today, the challenge is considering policy issues under the umbrella of shared values and ethical guidelines. So what I'm saying is, rather than trying to control and manage the nation states, I'm saying the global institutions, the global policy issues should be considered under the umbrella of shared values and ethical guidelines, overcoming unilateral dominance of institutions. So these are organizational structures to overcome social, economic, and ecological fragmentation beyond the domination of institutions. So again, hopefully this proposition I'm making, that it is not that I'm trying to say that institutions, global institutions, should develop themselves as viable systems. I'm saying they have to support the collaboration and support the avoiding fragmentation. Policy learning of particular nations and enterprises beyond the limitations of weak political and global institutions may offer desirable policy guidelines. So that's one of the aspects that I want to emphasize: policy learning of particular nations and enterprises beyond the limitations of weak political and global institutions. Together, institutions and related countries. Yes.
Well, just a quick interpolation there. When you say policy learning, do you mean learning about policies, or do you mean policy creation or policy proposing?
When I say I'm thinking in particular organizational systems that are dealing with situations that need to have policy learning, that need to, in a way, what I'm trying to say is the multiple resources that constitute a system need to develop their own structures towards learning, rather than separate the learning that is happening for a policy issue outside the main structures that are producing that organization.
So you're talking about creating policy, but within an institution.
Within these institutions and their related organizations, nation states, what I'm trying to establish is how is it that you create conditions for learning in the relationships between these institutions and the nation states, and that is what I'm now pursuing with this proposition that comes from von Förster, which is operate those systems, develop eigen behaviors. So what I'm saying, together, institutions and related will need to learn through collaboration to produce operational systems and self-organization process. Following from first that operationally closed systems develop eigen behaviors, this is a platform for policy learning, aim at strengthening global policies, such as reducing CO2 for climate control. Does it help with that?
Yes, well, it sounds to me like there has to be sort of learning, which leads to the creation of policy, or the strengthening of policy, or development of policy. So it's learning in order to improve policy.
Yeah, learning is. Sorry, anybody else is trying to say something? No. What I'm saying is that it is clear that learning is part of the process by which the institution, nation states, start to relate to each other, so that they increase their capacity to handle the policy issues that they are dealing with. So the learning in a way is strengthening the operationally closed systems. So if we have a number of nation states which are not very strong organizationally, one of the necessary things is to strengthen them through operationally closed systems. And the connections that they have in producing the global policy through the institution they are dealing with, requires that there is this connection with the environment through eigen behaviors.
I have a quick question. When you talk about learning, I have been thinking, could the concept of gaming is more accurate than learning? Gaming in terms of defending their own self-interests. I mean, the local smaller organizations or local smaller entities.
Or maybe
I'm not thinking about gaining in that sense. What I'm thinking is, as I was saying a minute ago, is that the organizational systems, or the nation states that belong to a policy issue, hopefully will develop structural strengths, and that development of structural strengths will be parts of processes of learning. And together, once you try to bring together the multiple nation states towards a particular policy issue, what is happening is that they're producing certain outcomes, which in this case, I'm saying only closed systems develop eigen behaviors. So that means that all the processes of creation within in the situation itself are generating stable developments in the environment. And those are the aspects that I'm interested in, and I call that learning.
So can we relate by learning to understand external goals, internalize them, and additionally develop the capacity to deal with them?
Yeah, I think learning requires, I think I want to repeat again a little bit that learning in this case requires to develop stable outcomes from the interactions of the multiple participants in a situation. And that is, in a way, could well be that the way they interact and relate could be fragmented and not really producing the outcomes that we expect for the policy issue, but they may well be more connected to the need to have stable outcomes that are seen as part of the policy issue that we are developing.
I think I see now that the key idea in here, Raul, is when you say in the first sentence, together institutions and the related countries will need to learn through collaboration. And through collaboration, they become, as it were, one larger system, an operationally closed system. I mean, I could express it as that they converse together and they become a larger Pascal P individual, but they become a larger system, more systemic, through these self-organizing processes of learning about each other. And as such a system, then they will develop eigen behaviors, which is stable behaviors, i.e. policies.
Yes, that's. I think you're right. You're right. I think on the whole, we are the whole process is collaboration, and the whole process is that in the end, the multiple organizational systems and resources related to a policy issue somehow get connected in the production of a stable outcome.
Thank you. I like that very much. I may have to leave shortly. I'm reminded of what it says, what Sun Tzu says in The Art of War. He said it's sensible for a small nation to get alongside a large nation in a kind of a cooperative way, and it's sensible for a large nation to get alongside small nations in a cooperative way. In other words, you get the cooperation and you avoid the conflict of war. So, I mean, Sun Tzu is all about how to avoid war, basically, through cooperation. Mutually advantageous cooperation.
But perhaps the point to add to that, Bernard, is the need of cohesion that requires that somehow the institutional context in which these relationships and are happening between the nation states, they somehow focus on values and directions that we call the policy issue.
Yes. Thank you.
Well, so, let me explain a little bit of where my comment comes from. There were two huge efforts trying to introduce the VSM methodology into China. One is done by Yongming Tang, who is a student of Barry and Fred Steyer from an Old Dominion University. He tried to sell the VSM model to China's central planning department or committee or whatever, the authoritarian unit. That project failed miserably. And also, I myself had tried to sell VSM model to one of the big cooperation in Shanghai. And we had long meetings. I did a lot of introductions, blah, blah, blah. Won't sell. So I have been wondering why VSM is looking so nice a model, so accurate and so makes sense, won't work. Even in a society like China, which is totally authoritarian and totalitarian, and huge hierarchical command and control structure. Ideally, if VSM can serve as an optimizer to get everything in place, but it failed. So that those experiences make me thinking, and I think what Raul talked about the Westphalia dilemma today is really a very universal phenomenon, not only among the globalization versus the nation states. It exists almost everywhere. So using the Chinese society as the example, from outside you see it is totally controlled, and people dream to have a general design department of national economy. They want to put everything in a planning in place, in a planning economy way. But they keep failing. Back in 1980s, I did a project of system dynamics modeling of my province's economy system. We had developed a huge model, like more than 400 equations. And we had to go to Beijing to use their larger computer to run it. During that process, we realized an interesting thing that we cannot incorporate in our model. The thing in a local saying is very popular saying, 上有对策下有，上有政策下有对策. Roughly translated, it says, from top down, there is a policy given to the whole organization. Now, from bottom up, they are strategies. In Chinese context, the concept of policy is very close to policing. So once you have a policy, it's a directive from top down, and people with power will enhance it, and you will have to obey. So policy equals policing. Now, from bottom down, there will be strategies. Strategy here means gaming. That's why I say gaming, because in China, they're organized into the something they call unit. So it's not an organization, it's not a company, it's not the self-organized organization that we are familiar in the West. They call unit. So a unit is theoretically is a cell of the huge entity, a huge system. But the fact or the reality is every of this small unity, this local organizations, they have what Raul pointed out, autonomous self-interests. And they have their own self-awareness and trying to defend their own interests. So when a policy comes from top, being enhanced on them, they always have some trick to develop to kind of make that policy ineffective. So I think this dilemma is universal. It's almost...
Jason, I understand the point that you're making, and I hope that when I made the distinction between hierarchical and non-hierarchical strategies, that I was dealing with that kind of problem. However, now, as we go further in our conversation, I will go exactly to the point that you're dealing, because I don't think that the problem is top-down or bottom-up. The problem is the interactions of different aspects that come together in something that I would relate to what I call the by-plan methodology. So if you allow me a few minutes to get there, I will try to answer your question.
Please, go ahead.
So, contributing to structural aspects of the UN Sustainable Development Goals through double closure should help their management. Eigen behaviors emerge as outcomes of operationally closed systems that cut across nation states towards achieving the necessary structures and economies for socially accepted global policies. So again, I will go to and reinforce the idea of double closure, which is one of the aspects, fundamental aspects I want to strengthen here in the processes of developing Eigen behaviors. So, and I will deal with the issue that you have just mentioned, Jason. Double loop learning is the outcome of two feedback loops between a system and its environment. The first learning loop is the outcome of the observed responses of the environment to the system's actions. These are responses to the system's strategic development and not necessarily to its operational closure. So here is a very fundamental point. Double loop learning is the outcome of two feedback loops. One is the loop that goes from the interactions of the system to its environment, and in general, the outcome of a strategic development, and not necessarily of its operational closure. Now, what do I mean by operational closure? I mean that what happens within the black box that I started showing at the beginning, there are relationships among the resources. And these relationships, which I connected to the viable system model, generate operational closure. This makes the distinction between what von Förster would call the trivial system, the trivial process where you have inputs and outputs coming from a black box, non-trivial situation where the most interesting aspect is all the relationships, use whatever complexity is happening within an organizational system. The second learning loop is the outcome of the organizational system structural transformations to maintain its adaptability in its environment. The two loops are complementary. The first takes place in the domain of strategy and information, while the second takes place in the operational domain of the organizational system. These two learning loops are accountable for the self-organization of the system. Here, I think I'm making a clear distinction between what most of the time people do, which is to look at the first loop, which is what I think von Förster would have called the trivial loop, and the most interesting loop, which is the loop of the interactions and relationships within the resources of the system that produce operational closure. So, and that's what the viable system model helps to do, to produce operational closure within the black box, and complementary to the first learning loop, we have the operational closure, which is that of the interaction relationships of the multiple resources, creating, regulating, and producing the different policies.
Raul, as Bernard here, I just want to clarify this. As I understand, this concept of double loop learning, originally introduced by our Gyrus and Schoen, whatever, 40 years ago.
Chris,
I think clearly Gyrus and Schoen.
Let me continue. It's our Gyrus and Schoen, and they, in the footnote, they say they've taken this from Ross Ashby's concept of a control hierarchy. So it's just a control hierarchy. It's two levels of control. First level, you do something. Second level, you monitor what the thing believes. And if it wasn't satisfactory, then you change it. So you change the lower level controller. Pascal uses it as a model of learning, where he calls learning an hierarchy of problem solvers. So it's hierarchical control. You can have more than two levels. But the important thing, there are two levels. This allows for learning or adaptation or evolution. So that's it. But you're adding into that the concept of the second loop being part of, or being, as it were, run by part of the organism's overall operationally closed structure or organization, if you like, which is fair enough. This is what happens. You know, if I'm going to learn how to ride a motorcycle, and I might fall off once or twice, but eventually I'll learn to stay on it. So the lower level controllers which manage the motorbike have been modified and improved by the higher level controllers which were monitoring my performance. So not saying something important, it's just that it's a kind of standard cybernetic model which acquired this terminology, double loop learning, and it made it something, it mystified something which is in a cybernetically straightforward.
Right, can I come in, Bernard?
Yes, of course, I finished. Oh,
yeah,
yes. Because
I think in the way I'm using double loop learning, which I'm very familiar with Shannon Ajairi's initial statement 40, 50 years back. Yes. But the two learning loops that I'm talking about is I'm much more interested in what von Förster would have called linear trivial machine, and the non-trivial machine where there is all kinds of transformations within the system itself, which generate new points of stability, and they are creating new forms of interactions. And so the two loops that I'm talking about is, one is the loop that goes from input to output, and the second loop is the one that is transforming things within the black box according to the issues of stability and all the aspects of regulation and quality of relationships that happen within the black box, and they change the processes within the black box, and they generate a new learning process, which is the one that the second learning loop is the outcome of organizational system structural transformation to maintain its adaptability in the environment.
No, you know, what we're saying, I think we're in agreement, Raul, and with respect to the overall behavior of the organization to adapt and learn, there may be more than one level at which the lower level systems are being modified and monitored. It's learning as an evolutionary process.
The learning is happening in evolutionary terms, yes.
Okay, yes.
So let me just complete. The second learning loop is the outcome of the organizational system structural transformations to maintain its adaptability in its environment. The two loops are complementary. The first takes place in the domain of strategy and information. The second, while the second takes place in the operational domain of organizational systems. And that's something that I have developed extensively in several papers that I'm not going to deal now in this occasion. These two learning groups are accountable for self-organization in the system. And now I want to move towards the Y-plan methodology towards recursive organization. So I'm now trying to offer a direction for improving the systemicity of the situation, of the policy situation. The enterprise complexity model and organizational learning have the Y-plan methodology as an important driver for recursive structures. The challenge is to support a learning process which starts from inadequate chaotic recursive structures towards recursive structures for policy issues as shown below. This is the Y-plan methodology. This is what the Y-plan methodology allows us to do, as is explained in this figure. So, what you have is, in the policy issue, you have, on the one hand, policy issues, international, I'm giving an example here, the International Energy Agency reducing CO2 emissions. Now, this is an interesting example because clearly the IEA has been trying to offer policies for CO2 emissions for decades. And they have produced multiple reports for those purposes. What is clear to me is that the IEA is essentially focused on policy structuration rather than implementation. So they are not offering any capacity to implement the policies that they are offering. And that's the thing that in the diagram that I have in front of you here, I'm trying to make it clear. I'm saying in the idea of generating policy, the IEA is very capable and very good. But while they have the capacity to generate that, they don't have the capacity to implement policies. And the result is that they need to depend on multiple organizational systems or nation states to generate, to implement the policies that they produce. And that is what I think is very important to get clear in the development of the approach that I am offering. What you have is the IEA is policy institution supporting a network of nation states and other institutions, including blue rectangles contributing to a viable policy. So the blue rectangles, where I have things like developers and R&D enterprises. In the energy sector, what you find is that they are independent entities, and that's where it comes to the idea of organizations. They are independent enterprises developing technology and developing research and development, but they are not part of the organizational system producing the energy. They are very much outside the energy producing system. The energy producing system is the one that has all the plans, the capabilities to implement the policies that have been established by the International Energy Agency. And so the real difficulty in order to build up a cohesive system is to connect what I show there as two nation states embedding plants and with operational closure, is to connect these nation states to resources for technology development and for R&D that bring together these things in a wider system, which is the system that will have capabilities not only to produce energy, which is what the different plants and the different energy producing systems have, but to connect them through technology developers and R&D enterprises to a one system, which is the one that I'm offering as the enterprise complexity model for the energy production, which includes not only production capacity, but includes R&D and so on. Global institutions, nation states, and policy and enterprises may come together to respond to a policy challenge. So to respond to the policy challenge of energy production and within an environment that is changing constantly, the requirements for energy, we need to produce something that goes beyond a viable system model and connects them in what I am calling here an enterprise complexity model. Is that sufficiently clear or not?
Yes, thank you, Raul. I'll say I found that clear.
Fantastic. Now, I want to show you what the Y-plan methodology is offering in order to balance, and I think I go to Jason's points about the failures and difficulties that they have in implementing the viable system model in China and Shanghai. I want to connect these to this methodology, which I have developed over a long period of time. And that's one methodology that is considering, on the one hand, what I'm referring to as the black loop, which is the inner loop, and a white loop, which is the outer loop. So if you have a policy issue, such as climate change, one thing is trying to structure the situation through names of relevant organizational systems and policy issues and policy issue focus. And that's something that moves from observing to naming systems. And what then happens here is that the organizational system, as I have suggested, is highly chaotic and not very well organized in the practice that we have everywhere. So organizational systems with or without double closure towards is to move in the direction of organizational systems with or without double closure towards recursive organizations. So the inner loop is trying to develop the organizational framework in which the policy issue is going to take place. And the main idea is to improve the cybernetics of the organizational system through inclusive participation and conversations. That's the way I move through the inner loop here. And through the outer loop, what I'm dealing is with the policy issues of interest. And in what happens there is that these policy issues have epistemological constructs, strategic double loop learning, and operational learning, which then they move in the direction of implementing the policies as they have through interaction, self-organization, and correcting variety imbalances. The interesting point here is that between these two loops, there is this reflexivity, which I am showing through the dotted lines in between the two loops, where the learning outer loop is in developing policy issues, is trying to, on the one hand, increase the quality of the structures underpinning the policy issue. So the black loop is essentially a loop to increase the quality of the structures underpinning the policy issue. And the more you increase the quality of the policy issue, the structure of the underpinning the policy issue, more you support the interactions in the modeling situation of the policy issue, such that they create interactions that move in the direction of improving the policy issue. So, in a way, I'm trying to reinforce the idea that modeling the policy issue may benefit out of improving the structural framework in which the discussion of the policy issue takes place. And that is what this inner loop is doing. So what you do, and that's the complementarity of the structural aspects of the situation of the policy, where you have multiple resources and you try to increase the quality, the systemicity of the situation in which they take place, and you improve them through conversations. And through these conversations, you create the conditions to improve the debates and discussions of the policy issues themselves. That is something that I think has been applied in a number of occasions, and would be very interested to see if I have made it clear or not.
Again, Ralph, I, for one, understand what you're saying, I think, quite clearly. It's not just a case of you're coming up with policy and trying to implement it. It's at the same time taking account or looking at how the organisations in questions are interacting with each other, and whether that made more effective, more systemic, if you like, through reflexivity and conversations about those processes, not just about policy per se, but about the process whereby policy is arrived at.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bernard. I think you are very clear about that. And as you see, what I started saying is that we have to move in the direction of systemicity, or improving the systemicity of the resources underpinning the policy issues of concern. And that's what the inner loop is trying to do. And the outer loop is essentially debating, discussing, and being involved in the modeling of the policy issues that are of interest to society. And that's where I think the reflexivity between the two is increasing the capacity, to, on one hand, recursive structures to underpin the development of the policies, and on the other hand, is creating better quality for the debates and discussions that are happening within the policy issues.
Yes.
I think you explained that better than me, so thank you.
Well, I have a slight advantage that English is my first language, Raul.
Very good.
But and also I'm familiar with the underlying cybernetics of what you're saying, particularly the concept of reflective practice, which you're applying at a global level, not just at an individual kind of practitioner level. That we should reflect on our practice, and we should hold conversations with everyone around us. I mean, in essence, that's what you advocate, but you're advocating in this very, very important context of improving collaboration in the development and implementation of policy.
Yeah, let me add one point there, Bernard, and that is that when we discuss the structures underpinning the policies, what we find are there are resources that are focused on what the situation is inside itself, and there are resources which are focused on the external environment and the world in which the policy issues are being discussed. And the interesting part of this is that as the purposes of the organizational system are developed, the ideas of who has to belong and participate in each of these two levels of discussion is very, very clear, very important. And one of the extraordinarily valuable things that you can produce with this is bringing together people with different perspectives and different interests into the discussions. And the ones with internal purpose and interest of making the system more effective in its own right, and the ones that are dealing with the problems of the external environment and the demands for change that come from the outside, the two together have to be balanced by the common purposes that are shared by them in the situation of concern. And that is where I believe we can improve the organizational situation, and we can improve the quality of the policy processes in order to make more likely that in the end the quality of policy will increase.
Well, a follow-on question from that, Raul. I mean, the ideal or the goal of improving these the coordination and the cooperation and so on, and the awareness of what's happening is clear. But with your VIPLAN methodology, you facilitate the implementation as a participant sort of action researcher consultant. You are in there doing the facilitation. Is there some equivalent role required at this level of nation states and global institutions for some people, some bodies, somebody to be facilitating these improvements?
Well, for the time's sake, we still have two perspectives to present. Stuart and Lou Kauffman. Are you there?
I'm here.
Thank you, Ben.
We're here.
We have two.
Oh, and Louis. Louis is there, yes. And Stuart.
I'm here.
We cannot see you, Stuart.
Let me try to. Does that help?
Oh, yes.
Right, we can see both of you.
Uh-huh. I didn't realize I was supposed to speak here. I'm very much enjoying hearing what Raul is saying, and I've learned a lot from him. I think it's a fascinating presentation.
However, yes, thank you very much, Stuart, for this. What I think is interesting is to discuss how is it that all this framework that I have been proposing may help to improve the quality of policy processes, which is the purpose I had at the beginning of this discussion.
Well, one of the things that occurs to me is this organization called the Salzburg Global Seminars. They've been going on for a very long time, based in Salzburg, Austria. And they bring together academics, business people, and government people to discuss large policy issues. And if you could get that group of people from different institutional backgrounds talking about these issues, I think that will bring about the change that you're trying for.
Yes, one thing that you are confirming in a way is that these people and not making this connection between structure and issue in the way that I'm proposing. And that would be fantastic to make that connection. Not very easy. You can see that in order to present these ideas, I have had to have a group of people who are very aware of cybernetics and all of these. And at the same time, I have a great difficulty, as Bernard clear, to explain many of these ideas. So I would be very, very happy to see that people like Bernard, Stuart, Louis, Jason come together and offer an alternative to the discussion of policy issues to this group in Austria.
Well, we might as well try to do it. One of the people who's very much involved with the Salzburg Global Seminar is Bill Reckmeyer, who's former ASC president, and he hasn't been attending our conferences as much recently, but for several years, but he's now working with us again. So I'll ask Bill if he could put this on the agenda.
Excellent. I am prepared to do that. I don't know whether Louis has some comments to make about whatever he has heard.
I do. But before I open my mouth, I think you might look at the last thing that Larry put into the chat line. He wrote, "I've come to a point where I've decided that if I cannot convince those with whom I'm talking that the world does not need to be treated as a game among leaders of nation states for control of limited resources, then I need to take my ideas elsewhere. I've reached the end of my patience." But this is the sticking point that we keep coming to whenever we think about these issues, is that the world seems stuck in that game and leadership model. So what do you have to say about that problem?
And also, Larry, where is that elsewhere? I mean, to Mars?
Yeah.
I'll
take my counters elsewhere.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I'm here right now.
You're there. Can you say?
Where is he elsewhere? I think we have to work with what we've got.
Larry, you're muted. You unmute yourself. Muted. He's still muted.
Yeah, you are right now.
I'm not hearing you, Larry.
Larry, that's it. You're unmuted now, Larry.
Speak. Oh, I was just responding.
He unmuted himself, right, Larry?
Yeah, I was just responding to Jason. I thought I was unmuted. No, I'm just saying it's a good question, Jason. And all I can say is I'm here right now.
So it's not elsewhere; it's here.
I'm trying to understand whether the proposals that are coming from cybernetics and essentially the ones I have proposed today are the proposals that we can transfer and pass to a wider audience so that they make sense of what we are saying, or otherwise we just forget it.
Mm-hmm.
Louis, does that help in any way?
I think many people are working on these issues, and people who deal with these organizations, all they have to do is go to a meeting and see that people aren't communicating or they're not understanding one another. And then you organize a new meeting, ideally with a different collection of people that will move the direction in a different, or move the conversation in a different direction. People with experience in government are quite experienced in doing these kind of things. That you don't have to have cybernetics language. It helps, at least for those of us who are familiar.
What it helps, in my view, is to understand the complexity of the structures underpinning policy issues that are not often recognized, and people talk about the strategies and information without understanding the underpinning structures. And that's something that I think I have tried to convey in this conversation.
Jamie,
Yes, that's
my question is a little bit for Stuart, especially since his last comments, but also Lou, Larry, Claudia, and Raul. In the slide that we're now looking at, I see nothing that indicates an educational institution. And for now, I call it the place where the lexicons are refined and also transmitted to the newcomers. Because this is a very dynamic process with people entering and leaving. And we have also a changing lexicon. Dus, for instance, when you're talking about gaming, I was reading the comments. I didn't hear you talk about the difference between zero-sum games and positive-sum games. And that's already a crucial distinction in terms of how people will behave. And I think especially when it comes to China, how the leadership is thinking there, whether they think of it as a zero-sum game or a positive-sum game. And that is, I'm just giving two words, labels, that mean a whole bunch of things. And so that's where I think the educational institution is important, because that just helps people understand the labels that are being used. And so, Stuart, how are your connections in government really keeping an eye on all the universities and their undergraduate program, that they have the correct courses in place to help people engage with those lexicons? Yeah.
Most universities now have policy centers or institutes, and that's one of the things they do is they organize lectures and discussions and bring people together. And usually they try to bring the people together, universities and government and business. That's just one of the things that they do. And they don't use the cybernetics language, but involving this kind of diagram and language is something they would understand.
Yeah, but I'm actually talking about the undergraduates. Dus whether there is someone monitoring whether the undergraduates are getting exposed to this language, so that they're able, while they make career decisions, to actually understand what it is that the cybernetics community is trying to pay attention to. So how much there is an effort really to see, so what are the undergraduates actually offered as courses that I can understand or get up to speed on the language as it is changing. So it's not so much research as to make sure that they understand.
Jamie, can I comment some of the points you have made? I think in the box designing at the bottom right side there, modeling policy issues, epistemological constructs, strategic double loop learning and operational learning, I am including aspects like zero-sum gaming and non-zero-sum gaming. And these are the aspects that are very, very much part of the debates and discussions when people are involved in policy issues. So the fact that I haven't mentioned them and included them is simply because I think the proposal or the ideas I was proposing were ideas about how to improve the quality of policy processes through both structure, which is the inner loop that you see there, and the actual content of the debates, which come through aspects like the ones that you have mentioned, and also I think the ones that Jason mentioned earlier about using systems dynamics and things of that kind. So the real issue now is that I am talking to a group of people that I think are in the field of cybernetics, and therefore they will somehow understand what I'm talking about. But obviously, if we want to move in the direction of education, it has to change completely.
I must agree with Raul.
Can I
Changing
say-
the language, and maybe also, you're providing a very good backgrounds for a game, which would be really easily accepted by the students, not in the form of providing them a theoretical backgrounds, but really experiencing a game which would incorporate these two loops. That might be really interesting.
Yes, but if I may add this, I just gave positive and zero sum as an example, but to point out there's two completely different views of the world, and I think that is exactly what Jason was talking to, that the challenge is in China. So you have these two different worldviews, but the skill of engaging constructively without getting emotional or whatever, and that is a skill that needs to be acquired by all the people that join the process. And so now we're talking with all very advanced thinkers, but the problem that you point out is the one of implementation, and implementation involves all these other individuals, and becoming familiar with working through the messiness, or what you call the chaotic nature of the process. I don't see that. I just see it as a given that people will become familiar, but that I don't see the model kind of saying, actually, we need to pay attention to this, that we help people become familiar with the messiness. Because a lot of people, they think, oh, the solutions, they just come by themselves. We just hire a bunch of experts and they'll figure it all out, and I don't have to do anything. I just have to whatever, let the experts do it all. While in reality, it's much more messier. So that was what all I was, and I think that is that's a component that explicitly, like undergraduate programs, play a role in. Okay, that was all I was trying to.
That's okay, Jamie. Thanks.
Yeah, excuse me. You had asked me earlier to share what I had prepared, and I had made some notes, which may be of some use. I'd like to show them. Could we do that now?
Have you put them in the chat so that I can see them?
No, I'll put them in the share screen.
Yeah. Do that,
if I could share screen.
Yeah, please. I don't control this thing. Yeah.
No, you can stop sharing. Stop sharing, and Lou will share.
Sharing. Jason, what do I do to allow Louis to come in?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out.
At the bottom of the screen, you have this stop sharing screen button. Just the similar one that you had to share the screen.
Stop sharing, it says, oh, you are...
At the bottom in the middle.
It's probably at the top for him when he's sharing.
Ah, there you go. Just a second here. Now, these are just, let me get this clarified a little bit. These are just some notes that I made before before the seminar, and I think maybe some of it may be of use. Let me take a few minutes and go through it. So you understand what this is. I'm sitting down before the seminar and writing some notes for myself. So the theme and the question: how can creative organization for solving, helping world problems such as peace, climate, environment, resources, and so on arise independently and or in relation to existing structures of nation states and also corporate structures that may in their own self-interest limit the needed open and collaboration across boundaries that's needed? That's the question. And then how does self-organization arise? Well, consider the Maturana-Uribe-Varela model. There are entities and there are certain points that are catalysts. And I want to look at this model as a conceptual model, not as a computer model. But the points, the entities, the catalysts, are in some space. They have some spatial relationships to one another. And in the original model, it was in a plane space. And we'll leave it to be in a plane space so that certain distinctions can be indicated spatially. The points, the entities, whatever they are, and they may be themselves autonomous entities, nation states, persons, whatever you want, like to link up and are promoted to link up by the presence of a catalyst. Now, as I say, I want to think about this ideationally. So a catalyst could be an idea, and the space can be larger than 2 dimensions, and it can be an idea that creates a linkage. It can be a physical presence that creates a linkage. But the linkage creates the beginning of a boundary. And in this model, curiously, the catalysts have trouble moving across the linkage. And that's a tactical piece of the model, which probably wants to be thought about a little more. But points in the presence of a catalyst tend to form links, and a link is a partial boundary. It doesn't want to go across. Given the presence of a linkage, then the way a catalyst will influence the situation has changed. That would be a more general way of saying it. And of course, decay of linkage is possible. And with only those principles, then a situation with catalysts and entities will become a situation with linked entities, and eventually linked entities that surround a catalyst. And when they do, they form cells. They form individual, partially autonomous entities that maintain themselves, because if you have a surrounding of the catalyst by the linkages, then if the linkages fail, they'll also be promoted to reconstitute. The cells will tend to maintain themselves, and you end up with the production of local autonomies in the situation. So we have that. You can see that there is a problem here. On the other hand, the process doesn't obviously scale to some next level of organizations of cellular entities, unless you thought of them as entities themselves. If you did, if you thought of the cellular entity as an entity itself, then you could allow the process to scale, but you haven't told how it will evolve. But this much arises from concept of space, concept of entity, concept of catalyst, and concept of linkage. And the concept of space is really the concept of relationship among the entities involved. It isn't necessarily that things are happening in a plane space or a 3-dimensional space. It has to do with the fact that somehow, in the presence of linkage, it's possible for the system to form enclosures or distinctions or self-sustaining entities in any case. And so we see the the evolution of self-sustaining entities from these initial situations of space, and as I say, relationship, entity, catalyst, and the desire or the possibility of linkage among entities. So you can imagine hierarchies arising in this way, and you see that, well, let me continue reading my notes. So we're concerned with later developments, much more evolved developments than what I started with. But on the other hand, what I wish to have started with could have been a later development, in the sense that the entities, the possibilities of catalysts, the possibilities of linkage, the possibilities of forming new, larger structures that are happening almost of their own accord, these can occur at any level in a system. So we're concerned with later developments, as I said, networks of entities that have observers, social structures, awareness of problems, desires to create connections across given structures. And we're also aware that such cross-connection occurs all the time in lots of situations when it is not obstructed, in sport, in business, in science, in engineering, in art and music. And it happens via language and information and connection when the tokens change are not by local entities. So such cross-connection is possible when the tokens of exchange are not forbidden. What is not forbidden is allowed. There's every reason to assume that it is possible for higher organization to form and creatively handle and explore problems, that we can do the kind of thing that Raul is talking about. But we have to face the actuality of entrenched power, fixed ideas of relationship, or Larry's kind of description of a world that seems to be gaming among powers. And the question is, can cybernetic understanding and action shift such structures? So the point I think that I realized that I'm making that I didn't understand so fully when I wrote these notes a little while ago is that they may be pedagogically useful as well as generalizing certain ideas. That is, if you want to tell somebody how it is that self-organization can arise, this story of entities that like to link and catalytic situations that would link them, and then the fact that if they link enough, if they form enough of a larger structure, they have their own autonomy, particularly in relation to catalysts, which can be strong ideas or needs, such as needs for solving global problems. This simple story involving a few diagrams and the ideas of entity, linkage, space may be helpful in explaining cybernetic ideas. But I think also it may be helpful to us for thinking about what we want and what we want to do here. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Luis. I think the basic idea of self-organization is one that I can relate to the notion of recursion, structural recursion.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely the point that I have tried to strengthen in this case, because everything I've been trying to say that is important to improve the systemicity of the situations that we are dealing with, and that implies to increase the quality of the complexity management through recursive structures, and that these recursive structures need to have self-organization and produce self-organization. And I believe that you are offering forms of dealing with them in a more precise way, which I think would require more attention in the future.
We are hoping that that the need for, say, solutions to climate, to choose one, would become pressing enough for enough people so that they would and start to form local organizations and then more global organizations to such a strength that it would overrun whatever resistances there are among particular states or particular directions, right? So what you are describing are the underlying cybernetics of how that might come about.
Following your own arguments, Luis, how would you propose this discussion can continue?
That we're having, or what you raised earlier, how do we bring other people into such a discussion about using cybernetics?
Yeah, my impression is that we need to clarify as much as possible our own understanding of these issues. And it is as soon as we get more comfortable with the different aspects that have been discussed today, we may bring in other people to other groups. So for the time being, I'm much more focused on on the situations as produced by this group of people as we have today.
Well, I'm very interested in what constitutes effective catalyst. In science, you see it a lot, right? Like at a certain point, somebody discovers something that's so riveting that all the others pile in, and it creates an entire field of action, like the discovery of DNA replication by Watson and Crick, or many other examples where the catalytic behavior is very clear. And people in those situations, or in artistic situations, they're just feeling free to move into something where they see they can do something. I would like to see people feeling that kind of desire for action and seeing what they can do in these problems of the world, like climate and other things. I'd like to see that same kind of moving together to work on them.
Jason is a good catalyst, right?
Say that again. You said
said
X is a good catalyst, and I missed what you said X was.
Jason is a good catalyst for Club of Remy.
The Club
Absolutely.
of Remy is a good catalyst.
Yes, yes, that's
Club
true.
Of Remy.
Yes. That's self-referential catalyst.
We call it a facilitator. In order to become a good facilitator, you have to take off your hat of the world leader, or the intellectual genius, or the what I say should be the truth, and you guys all need to accept. We have to totally remove that, and put another cap saying, okay, I'm facilitating you guys to talk with each other. And hopefully consensus will emerge from putting all the perspectives together.
Right. So that same way of being could be extended to larger groups of people in relation to these kinds of problems. It has to be, as you say, just the opposite of the kind of polarized speech that goes on out there.
Yeah, hard work.
Can I say something? One of the clearly is that the notion of conversation is itself not very clear. Usually it means, or in many situations, it means that one person is explaining to another person what it is that he or she wants you to do, which is not very much of a conversation. I'm thinking of a dance. Suppose there is a dance somewhere and I come in and I see everybody dancing. How would they convince me to dance as well? There is a very difficult process. They cannot say to me, we are dancing, why don't you join us? No, it's much more complex. You have to demonstrate how essentially pleasant it is, and then I can join and try to emulate you, and then I can develop the structures that make it possible for me to dance. So I think the notion of conversation itself must be really explored. It is not very useful to know that there is something like conversation.
You're speaking of the art of conversation.
I'm speaking of the art, yes. And I think that
Indeed.
is what is happening.
Well, we're hoping that this club, Remy, is promoting an art of conversation.
Good.
And Gerard, I think one aspect, we have, on the one hand, we have conversation in the operational connections between the people with no need to pass a language from one to the other, with no need to develop the conversation in the shall we say, the informational domain. On the other hand, we have usually we have to pay attention to conversation in both aspects, which relate to the strength of the actions in which we are involved, and at the same time the possibilities to transmit a view and an action from one to the other.
I'd like to share something for a moment. I'll show you what it is. This came across yesterday. It is a reminiscence of Vaughan Jones, who was a very great mathematician who passed away recently, and Dennis Sullivan is reminiscing about him. But listen to what Sullivan said about Jones. Vaughan Jones' mentor, Alain Cohn, was a fixture at IHES, that's the institute in France. And Vaughan Jones, during the 80s and 90s, made several visits to IHES, staying at their residence dorm. A decade before, a volleyball court had been set up adjacent to the sandbox for the younger kids of the families of the visitors staying at the residence. The older kids would watch and occasionally join the volleyball games. This featured less and less as these games became more serious and competitive. There were some fantastic players from Russia, especially the senior Kirillov of representation theory. The atmosphere became serious, and novices rarely ventured onto the court. Vaughan Jones, very good at sports, would play when he visited. Slowly, things started to change. He encouraged everyone interested to join in. He made this realistic by taking the hard serves and returns and giving a perfect setup to any novice who had joined, who could then set up the final slam return. His friendliness and personality in these perfect setups saved the day. Expert slammers and novices were playing together. Teams were working to improve skills. There was still competition, and a good time was had by all.
Wonderful. That is precisely how I think that I like to treat my PhD students. You don't tell them what their PhD is. You challenge them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think this is perhaps the distinction I'm making between operations, where you challenge them, and the other one is when you tell them what to do. And clearly we are in the domain that we are talking about now is the operations.
silence means great thinking is going on, right?
One of the things I've noticed when I read Raul's stuff is that there are phrases in there that I have heard before, but don't really know what they mean. I give an example is recursive structure. This is not too strange a word, but it's not common in ordinary language. How would a recursive structure differ from an organizational structure? I know it would recur.
Well, if you look up recursion in the ordinary dictionary, you find that it is pinned with something that is defined in terms of itself.
That's it. And clearly, when I use the word recursive structure, is saying that the same thing repeats itself at multiple levels, which is different to the organization.
But isn't repetition not the one thing that you are looking for? It's actually that you want to get out, escape from the recursion. It's the freedom that you seek, not the recursion that you seek.
What in what I wrote, what I'm proposing is that recursive structure means that we distribute the response capacity throughout, rather than have a hierarchical level imposing a view about the whole situation. So that's the difference that I'm making, and that's where I have been saying recursive means increasing the complexity response to policy issues from organizations that I'm dealing with.
But how is a recursion a challenge? That's my problem.
Well, the recursion is a challenge in the sense that more often what you do is you impose hierarchies and not offer the opportunity for distributing the response capacity throughout the organization. And the challenge is producing the response capacity throughout the organization.
Recursion in that sense is a patterning. No? Bateson would call it patterning. It's a meaning creation, no?
It is more than meaning creation, is a response capacity. Because I remember that I introduced this notion in the context of the law of requisite variety. So it's more than meaning is response in the we increase for making. What I am expecting is that different organizations, different collectives will increase their capacity to handle the situations, like in the case of climate change and so on, where most of the time there are a few people who are imposing their views at the expense of the distributed capacity of the whole system to offer something that can be handled effectively. And that is what I would call a recursive structure offering a response.
Do you see recursion and eigenbehavior as essentially the same?
No, I see that there are two different types of recursions in a way, because eigenbehavior, I see it as the stability of meaning that is proposed.
You associate it with meaning.
Yes, but in the case of recursion, structural recursion, I'm basically offering a view of how to distribute response capacity throughout the society in order to make more likely that we will handle situations in ways that improve the response to society, the response capacity to people and societies.
One of the things I've been working on is methods of participation. And that sounds very similar to what Raul was talking about. There's a lot of work that's been done on participatory methods for this. And Zhizhuan did all in China. So I'm glad to see the connection here to recursion and eigenvalues and so forth.
I think the overall issue that I would like to convey is that the capacity of people to coordinate and collaborate in processes that lead to improved policy making is a capacity that can be connected to the structures that underpin them, in addition to the fact that they have content of their own and therefore can be handled in the two loops that I described.
No more comments? We are half an hour past our time limit. Do you want to close?
Is you the one who is running the? I am happy. I can continue this for a long time, but it all depends. I can see that Stuart is coming with some ideas that relate to the work he does. Luis has added some fundamental aspect of self-organization that I would like to explore in more details. And Gerrit has created some important challenge to the notion of conversation, and these are all aspects that I believe this group has been producing at the moment. So if there is anything coming from the rest, I will be happy to stay here. Otherwise, we just go.
Why don't you finish your slides? I think you still have 3 slides haven't shown to us.
Sorry, are you talking to me? How do you see
I think you have a total of 27 there.
Well,
yes,
you don't want to miss anything, do you?
Yeah, we can see what's your final conclusion of the
final things. Let me see whether I can go back to that.
Yeah, we stopped at your 24 or something. So you have a.
Yeah, no, I went to 26, and then I think 27 is the conclusion in a way. Now, whether I can go back to that.
Yeah, you can just do share screen.
Is that shared or not?
Not yet. You click the green button, share screen. And
right.
then
I think I need to go back to your. I want share screen. Is that shared now?
Yes, coming.
Right.
Now you are on page 6.
I want to go to the bottom here. So that was the last thing that we discussed, and then in this slide I'm just explaining the inner and outer loops. The cybernetic inner loop is meta to the distributed problem solving of stakeholders' interactions in the outer loop relevant to the particular policy issue. For instance, understanding how to control CO2 emissions in a situation of climate change, or more generally, for the purpose of an in-depth modeling of any policy issue. The purpose of this cybernetic inner loop is to promote a good cybernetics, that is, to make organizational conversations and communications as effective as possible through processes of self-organization, Gosh, I think the 3 points here, I come to the issues that were made by Heard, Lewis, and Stuart. So the operations of the inner black loop and the outer white loop, the cybernetic inner black loop contributes to improving the structures of the organizational system dealing with the policy situation. The cybernetic inner loop is meta to the distributed problem solving of shareholders' modeling of the interactions of the outer white loop relevant to the particular policy issue. For instance, understanding how to control, yeah, I think that's all there. And improving the policy issues with the support of cybernetics. The two loops are reflexively related, dotted line between them in the sense that as the cybernetics of conversations in the inner loop improve the cybernetics of the stakeholders' appreciation of a policy issue in the outer loop, the outer loop, the policy issue evolves. That is, the outer loop becomes more coordinated and sophisticated, triggering reflexive changes, conversations, and structures in the inner loop. The reflexive towing and throwing between structure and policy develops the enterprise complexity model for the policy issue, from where improved recursive structures should emerge. As seen in the diagram, the aim is building up self-organization towards correcting variety imbalances at several structural levels. This is the problem of organization. This is a fundamental learning process towards moving in the direction of operational closure for policy issues of societal significance. This is a means of producing eigen behaviors with the capacity of improving learning in those issues that society needs to deal with. So, Jason, is that enough?
Well, it all sounds very promising, but I pay more attention to how are you going to implement it. I mean, how?
No, I didn't offer I didn't offer how to implement this. I think I am working in implementation, and that's going to happen sooner or later. So what I have offered, and what I did offer, was to discuss how to deal with policy issues through structural backing and all the interactions that I have described and talked about.
Any more comments? If not,
thank you, Raul. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes,
let
thank
me
you.
propose thinking of maybe not only two loops, maybe there are the third loop somewhere.
Can you offer that to me?
Huh?
Can you offer to me the third loop, please?
Yeah, because I had a little theory about a four-dimensional system of thinking, and the three-dimensional observables, and the fourth one is time and waiting for self-organization emergencies. So the first one is the process, and like people doing quality control, they focused on how do we improve our processes of doing things. And the second dimension is the structure. So it's the skeleton, or it's the institution, it's how those connections are made. So you have to, for human body, you have to use an X-ray to see that structure. You have a bone structure, you have a nervous system structure, you have your vessels, things like that. And the third dimension is culture. It's the value, it's the culture. So it's procedure, structure, and culture. Sorry.
The only thing I would say, Jason, to this is that all these aspects, I see them deeply connected to themselves. I don't make distinctions of structure and process, and they are together generating what we can do in our problem solving or policy issues that we are dealing with.
Okay, I have something I can dig it out from my hard disk and send to you later about that three-dimension.
I would hope to get from you that the only thing I don't want is to make structure and process something that are not deeply connected and producing the same understanding through one reflexively through the ways I have explained.
Okay. So 10:37 now. Maybe we need to close and looking forward.
Are you frustrated that we haven't gone into 3 hours?
Not yet.
Stuart, do you have anything more to say?
You're muted. Unmute.
Well, I enjoyed this conversation very much, and I'd like to continue it on another occasion. And I'll try to get Bill Reckmeyer involved.
I think it would be great to have another installment of this conversation. Yeah.
Right.
Who is going to make the production for that?
Ron.
As long as you want to do the second session, we can schedule it. And somebody needs to make some presentation and to continue. Maybe Lou, you can develop, update what you just handwritten notes.
Yeah, I'm willing to do that. Someone else should do something as well.
And the second one should be Stuart.
Well, I would like to do something on these terms that we're using, because I found the discussion of recursive structures very fruitful. And so if we spend a little time saying what we mean by operational closure and so forth, I think that would certainly be helpful for me and maybe for others as well.
Do you want to do this in September, in December?